So hi everyone, and welcome to Module 5 of the Mishcon Sports Law Academy. My name's Tom Murray, but many of you will know me by the alias Sports Law Tom on Instagram. I'm an associate in the sports group and also sit as a member of the esports group, and I'm also head of Sports Law Academy. Now, tonight's event promises to be even more provocative than Meghan and Harry's Oprah Winfrey interview, and every bit as interesting. And just like Meghan and Harry, we're breaking from tradition and moving from sports law into esports and video gaming. Now, this is a space that as a firm we've been involved in for a number of years. We've advised the likes of Nintendo, eStars, professional Counter-Strike players, talent, as well as publishers and developers. Now, we've had a number of new signups for today's event. So for those of you who are new to the Sports Law Academy, the Sports Law Academy is a free-to-access academic and distance learning program that's designed to improve participants' understanding of contemporary sports law issues. As always, we want this event to be as interactive as possible, so please do send through your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom, and we will do our best to answer as many of these as possible. Now, for today's event, I'm delighted to be joined by three titans of the video gaming world. First up, we have Andrew Cooke, who is General Cook at Fnatic, who many call the Real Madrid of esports. Fnatic operate teams across League of Legends, Counter-Strike, Fortnite, and PUBG Mobile, amongst others. And Andrew himself trained at Norton Rose and qualified as a litigator before moving to Flash Entertainment in Dubai, where he built and led Flash's award-winning legal department. Now, Andrew, I'm a bit disappointed you didn't go for the line, showed flashes of excellence in your bio, but never mind. Andrew has been at the helm of the Fnatic legal team since September 2019 and has adopted best practice from across various sectors to help develop the organization into a global esports performance brand. Next up, we have German lawyer Moritz Mehner, who has a particular specialism in esports. Now, Moritz is a senior associate at SKW Schwarz, who focus predominantly on technology clients. Now, Moritz has advised numerous business within the video gaming industry, including in relation to data protection, licensing, and regulatory issues. So dankeschön for joining us, Moritz. And last, by no means least, I'd like to introduce Stuart Lester, who is a leading associate in the Mishcon Brands and Sports Group. Now, Stuart acts for a number of major brands, including the likes of Alexander McQueen, Bet365, Global Media, NBC Universal, and Pragmatic Play. And for those of you who attended the last Sports Law Academy session, will remember his previous talk on the IP issues in sports. Now, firstly, can I say a huge thank you for this esteemed panel today. For today's session, we're going to hear individual presentations from Andy, from Moritz, and then from Stuart, before opening this up to a discussion and Q&A. If you have any questions for our panel, please do send these through, as we'd be delighted to hear from you. Now, Andy, we'll start with you, who will be focusing on the three key issues and opportunities in esports and video games generally. Andy, over to you.
Hello, everybody. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me today. And also, thanks very much to the panel for joining into the session. Anybody who's watching, I really do encourage you to chip in with your comments. We're going to be looking at the world of esports more generally. We're going to be looking at where esports is at strategically and some of the lessons that it's learned from the course of COVID. So it's over a year now since IEM Katowice took place behind closed doors. That was the first event or major event in esports, in that case, a Counter-Strike major that was affected by COVID. Interestingly, here in the UK, we subsequently had the Cheltenham Festival and, of course, the Liverpool Atletico Madrid Champions League match, aka the super spreader events. So in many ways, esports was slightly ahead of the curve in terms of how it responded to COVID. We're going to talk about several organizations that have been quite heavily affected by COVID in the course of esports, in terms of looking at their esports strategies going on. We're going to talk also during the course of the session today about some things that I'm particularly passionate about. So, for example, safeguarding and this interaction between organizations and players. Tom's going to ask me some questions about the Motown era of esports, which is something that I've talked about before. One of the things that is a definite trend is the rise of player power within esports, and also the fact that the top players, who tend to be men, but the top players are now seeing their salaries at the same level as Bundesliga, sort of lower tier Serie A, and high tier championship level players in football. So as those player salaries and spends go up and their profiles increase. We've also seen players move out of being strictly players into a realm of entertainers and then pricing themselves accordingly. And I was talking with another team the other day, looking at how they benchmark their social media profiles of their players now. So the players that they're looking for, this organization is quite entertainment focused. The players that that organization is playing for, is targeting to acquire, they're benchmarking their social media profiles, not against other esports pros, but now against what you might describe as the creme de la creme of social media, your Ronaldos and Ariana Grandes. That's their aspiration for their kind of players in terms of how they're going to break out. And of course, so many teams also are still selling their talent as the mediator between the kids, for want of a better phrase, esports being very attractive to that younger demographic and brands. I think that arbitrage opportunity is starting to close, but nevertheless, there's still lots of brands who are interested to speak to young people. That also includes traditional rights holders. One of the things that Fnatic has really seen in the last year is that as traditional sports have started to look for new ways to attract fans, it being generally the case that interest of millennial and Gen Z groups in esports is effectively falling off, right? There's lots of reasons for that. We can perhaps probably slightly outside of the scope of this session, but ultimately that is a trend, it's a fact. That a lot of those traditional sports brands are starting to look to esports as a way to attract young people and sort of grow their audience and put it in new places, for reasons that we'll also discuss later on, particularly around Schalke and their potential sale of their franchise in LEC. I think that approach is really flawed, and also necessarily that the digital audience isn't, or the audience of people who watch esports isn't necessarily driven by their interaction and an interest in traditional sports brands. Pardon me. The reasons why people watch esports are complex, but they don't just relate to as an expression of fandom. In fact, the primary driver of people watching esports is interest in getting better at games. And that's also a factor which we can unpack in terms of brand consideration. Tom, I wanted to get into the subjects actually that we have lined up in the questions, if that's okay, because I think particularly there's a lot of time to talk about, or time we need to spend talking about that strategic piece in COVID.
No, perfect. Please do. Thank you.
So we wanted to talk initially about North, and you'd observed, Tom, I think that North, which is principally a Counter-Strike and FIFA organization, had recently closed up.
Yeah, that's right. So, so for those of you who don't know, North are a Danish esports organization that were created in collaboration between FC Copenhagen and another organization. And investors in North have recently concluded that whilst there's potential in esports and gaming, the timeline is long and it's an uncertain one. Andy, I know you read up on the statement given by North there. What are your thoughts there on the statement? How would you unpack that?
Yeah, well, I think so. There's two elements of the North statement that I really wanted to focus on, because I think they tell the story of the last year in esports. Really, I think North talks about the time horizon. It talks about, and it conflates how COVID has affected sports and esports organizations. And I mean, that is of course North's perspective, and they're entitled to it. I would not share that same view. So most esports teams monetize along three verticals. Right, so they have what we call media rights revenue, which is basically broadcast equivalent in traditional sport. Mm-hmm. They have partnership revenues. So Fnatic partners, I'm proud to say, include BMW and AMD and Monster Energy. And then they sell products. And those products are typically apparel, but also in-game items, so game skins and those kind of things. And we're seeing in-game items, particularly in CSGO, being a really quite significant source of revenue. And it'll be interesting to see where the LEC goes in that regard. And we can talk about LEC revenues and LEC sustainability later. So all those revenues sort of, that's most teams. Fnatic is slightly different. I'm wearing a Fnatic headset. We make performance esports equipment available at shop.fnatic.com for anybody who's interested in that. Really outstanding gift.
And all good retailers.
Item. Yeah, and all good retailers. So we're slightly different that way. We have that fourth vertical. So what happened? So what was the assumption that most esports teams were making? The assumption was, as viewership increases, okay, revenues from those three verticals will also increase. They'll effectively correlate. So what happens in COVID? Viewership explodes. So Twitch viewership went from kind of mid 1 billion to 3.5 billion or something in that kind of order in Q2, and then up to 5.7 billion in Q3. That's cumulative watch hours. So the amount of time that people spent watching Twitch streams. So viewership has arrived. Fantastic. What's happened to revenues? They've gone absolutely nowhere in the broad sense. So what North's talking about when it says the time horizon further down the line is, I assume that North's presumption was that actually media rights are what are going to make esports teams make money. Eventually, someone will want to pay enough for people to play pro esports that, just like they do with Premier League football, you see that same curve that you saw between, let's say, 2004 and nowadays in relation to media rights sales in esports. And when those viewership figures turned up, that didn't happen. So maybe that was their core assumption.
Do you think that the esports teams need to look to diversify their income here? And do you think they should be looking at other areas and other ways to monetize outside of relying on sponsorship, or the sort of vain hope that somewhere along the line there'll be these broadcasting fees that come through?
Well, I think not everybody. I mean, it's like, clearly it's not a zero-sum game, right? And it's not like if BMW sponsors Fnatic, then there are not other vehicle manufacturers, mobility providers that are going to come in and be attracted into the space by BMW and kind of want to participate in it. So that's true. But I do think that those kind of revenues are likely to coalesce around the major teams. And again, that's the learning from football, right? EFL teams can occasionally struggle, or tier 2 and below teams can occasionally struggle to attract top tier sponsors because the big money wants to go where the eyeballs are. So in that sense, there is that correlation. But again, how many non-endemic brands, i.e. brands that are not computer gaming brands or other brands that are currently participating in esports, are actually going to want to put their money where their mouth is in the kind of way that supports those huge salaries that I was talking about earlier on? I mean, if you are Astralis, which is a particularly significant brand, storied brand in CSGO, Danish listed entity, it's paying its players that kind of money. We know this because it's listed, so it has to disclose it. If you're paying your front five in CSGO 350,000 euros each, right, and that's before they get into their individual endorsement deals, and your total revenues a year are 8 million euros, those numbers are not particularly great unless you've got a way to really make that work. And I think, as much as big investors want, there is money available in the market. We talked about this in our sort of pre-chat. There is a lot of money around. That's fine, but investors do want to see a return on that, and they're not necessarily prepared to wait forever. So I think you've seen a lot of strategic moves driven by this recognition that esports is not going to immediately deliver a return when viewership goes up. And that's what drives things like, 100 Thieves getting out of CSGO. They made a decision that wasn't for them. They sold that on to another organization. Other teams moving into things like platforms, digital products more aggressively, almost pivoting away from esports as a product of itself and towards esports as a marketing channel for other people's products. So that's a spin on the sort of FaZe Clan esports 1.0 way of just driving hype around products through just incredible social followership and sort of YouTube and Twitch viewership, and just leveraging that into brands. So a lot of moves in that space, and there will likely be other orgs that fall over during this period as we move out of these current restraints back into LAN, but also recognizing that some orgs will just not be able to make the numbers work.
No, of course. We'll go on to talk about Schalke, who are another example of a team in financial difficulties a bit later. But Andrew, I'd be keen to get your understanding. We touched on the end of the Motown era of esports professionals. And one of the things that we've seen, particularly on the deals that we've acted on, is that often esports players and professional gamers are classified as independent contractors, and they're not given the same protections or the same status protections as you might get if you're classified as a worker or an employee under the UK employment law. So what's your experience of that at Fnatic? And do you think the recent decision of the Supreme Court in Uber is likely to change the approach of esports teams?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I think there's two things. There's the Uber decision, which you're absolutely right to focus on. There's also IR35, which is a change in tax law in the UK. Both Uber and IR35 have the same thing in common, which is if it looks like an employee and it sounds like an employee, it's probably an employee, right? So
or a worker.
Right, correct. So in Uber, it's which is a quite, I mean, interesting is a pretty bold adjective to throw around Supreme Court decisions, but it is a readable judgment, and particularly the Supreme Court there really went out of its way to curb stomp every possible argument that Uber might want to bring to bear. One of the key principles there was, or that's one of the key arguments for Uber was, we have a contract with the drivers, and then we facilitate a contract between the driver and the passenger, and everybody is completely clear on what that contract is. It says that the drivers are independent contractors. It says that they're not entitled to any employment-type benefits, like all this kind of stuff, and that's where we should start the conversation. The conversation should start with the paperwork that everyone's agreed. And the Supreme Court said, no, it doesn't. Again, if it looks like an employee, it sounds like an employee, etc. Right, so I think this is an area of maturity for esports teams. I don't necessarily, like so many things in growing organizations, things are done at the start, sort of pre-growth. As we hit that first organizational development ramp up, people make decisions that aren't necessarily founded in a fully rounded appreciation of the associated risk, right? And again, I think...
Yeah,
go on.
So I was just going to say, I feel like the Supreme Court there was sort of looking through any sort of contractual relationship, looking to the substance as opposed to the form, and irrespective of what's written down on the piece of paper. Like you say, if someone appears and has all the benchmarks and badges of being an employee, they should be categorized as an employee. But given it in esports that often people are categorized as independent contractors, do you think this will lead to a change of approach where teams might, as they do, say for example in the LEC where members of the team have to be employees? Do you think that's something that UK teams will be looking to adopt going forwards?
Yeah, I mean, we recently engaged a Valorant team, largely UK based. They are employees, and our expectation is that eventually Valorant will franchise, and at that stage, Riot will bring that same requirement. And I'm supportive of that, because ultimately, we'll touch on this when we talk about safeguarding, but teams should recognise that they have a duty of care towards employees, and even if employees are, and that applies whether or not they're independent contractors or employees. Clearly, the employment relationship drives that sort of almost fiduciary angle a little bit more strongly, right? But nevertheless, the teams do have an obligation to the young people, often very young people that are involved in esports. And again, we can draw that out. I think it's not quite as cut and dry as it's always in the interest of the player to be employed, right? There are some circumstances certainly where we've had players, who have been well advised from let's say a tax standpoint, who want to structure their financial affairs through an earn out, just as people do in music and entertainment. I mean, in my previous life, I've dealt with plenty, if you engage the Rolling Stones, you sign 3 contracts, right? One of them is for the performance, one of them's for the IP, and then there's kind of like a profit sharing contract that deals with other bits. It's very heavily structured. There was 270 pages of the performance agreement that I signed in relation to Rolling Stones for Andy Murray, right? Andy Murray was one of the first players to carve off his image rights. We signed 2 contracts signing him for Mobile World Tennis Championship. So let's not be necessarily naive around how effectively these players are advised. And I would also, again, repeat, I am all for that. Like having great advisors on the other side of the table when we're sitting down for, during the LEC transfer window is a huge relief, right? Because again, we have seen players who are advised by I mean, again, I'm sure this will be your lived experience, advised by their parents or advised by a sibling or advised by, somebody who is very, very interested in maximizing the most money they can make, but mainly for their 15% rather than looking after the career of the player. And again, what we want to bring to bear when we talk about performance in esports quite often is that, Fnatic should be taking people into its organization and having them leave in a better place, not just financially, but in terms of holistically, right? They're around their nutrition, around their well-being, around their approach to sport, and also, as we saw with our Got Your Back campaign with UNICEF, right? Also aware of how they can use their immense value and their incredible audience to actually drive social change in a positive way. So, we have a streamer affiliate network, Fnatic Network, that has a broad gender split. We saw a streamer in that network make some comments around trans rights. He's a Brazilian League of Legends player. Trans rights being a huge issue in Brazil, right? For lots of reasons. We find out about that via Twitter because he's just streaming live effectively in the middle of the night in the UK. And how did we resolve that? Well, he said some things that were ignorant. He used the power of his platform. We encouraged him to use the power of his platform to engage with his audience and bring that issue to life for his audience, right? So basically to lean into the issue and say, I don't know anything about this. I want to know more about it rather than just continually sort of misspeak about it. And he invited some members of the trans community onto his stream and they worked it out. Like, that's exactly how that sort of thing should work. These people are in extremely powerful positions in terms of audience and ability to connect with young people. And we also want to bring that to bear as well in terms of social issues.
No, of course. Andrew, you touched on the work you've been doing with UNICEF there, and I'd be interested to explore what your views are on safeguarding in esports and also video gaming sort of more generally. We've obviously seen quite a few sort of Me Too moments within esports over the past year or so, and a Method is an example of that, but a team that's sort of really tried to take some quite serious measures to address the issues that were identified. What work do you think esports teams should be doing, and how do you think esports teams could learn from perhaps best practice that's been adopted in traditional sports?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's as you say, it's something that I feel very strongly about, and I know that there are some. I can see in the comments, and I also know from my own sort of socials that there's a lot of interest in this particular space, and it's appropriate. I think I talked earlier on about structuring things in a way that addresses risk holistically, not being top of mind for organizations, right? And I think safeguarding is one of those issues that it takes a large organization, like a well-resourced sort of prominent organization like Fnatic, to address those kind of issues. Because even just if I just think about the layers of protection that apply to, say, a young elite level footballer, right? You have the FA safeguarding scheme, you have the Premier League's safeguarding scheme, and both of those schemes obligate clubs to meet certain standards, which are then audited by those sort of regulatory bodies, right? So, and there are sanctions attached to those audits, obviously, if they're not effectively done. Young players also benefit from support from the PFA. There are lots of ways in which football has sought to learn from some of its lessons, some of them very hard lessons, over the course of the last sort of decade or so. Esports, obviously, the sort of regulatory team, also league operator role can sometimes be conflated. So within League of Legends, obviously Riot is playing both of those. In Counter-Strike, you have Valve and, say, ESL. But nevertheless, neither of those organizations see it particularly as their sort of obligation to get involved in this area and start to lobby for safer esports. And I think part of the challenge in that regard is online toxicity, just like the crowd at a football match, right? Most of the commentary from a football match, at least in my experience, perhaps this is just Middlesbrough fans, is not positive, right? It's not like, go on, you're doing super well. It's really not quite the other end of things. And we see that reflect that's a societal issue in terms of how people comment and use social media. And I think part of the challenge here is that people are conflating the potentially challenging environment, the challenging nature of the conversation that goes on in esports, and let's say around the gaming community generally, with safeguarding as an issue. And those things need to be delinked, because what we're actually talking about here is that holistic duty towards players, and particularly recognizing that some of the players who have significant value in a game like Fortnite, for example, are children. You know, they are 50. If you look at the Fortnite World Cup, which was one of the big kind of breakthrough events in esports, the guy who won, Booger, I think he was 16. Right, the highest scoring or the highest ranking British player, Wolfies, who's obviously now on a pro contract with our good friends at Excel, I think he was 15. And a guy that was subsequently signed by FaZe was 14. Right, so again, a very high profile, very young children. Let's call them what they are. They're kids, right? Earning huge numbers, but also having these huge social audiences. Who is looking out for those kind of people? That's where I start. And again, in my experience of working with UNICEF is not involved in our processes now. I've been very grateful to be engaged with the safeguarding community in football. So I don't know if any of them are present in this in the audience, but we've had the Premier League be extremely supportive of what it is that we're doing. We've had particular clubs. So our friends at Manchester City, who I've worked with in my previous career, friends at Manchester City have been very supportive as well. What we found is that the safeguarding community, when it looks at some of the issues in esports, and particularly how young pros are approached, which tends to be in private social media environments, how young pros are looked after in boot camps, which are often, again, not risk assessed, right? There's no sort of like sense of controlling the environment in a way which makes it safer for young people in esports. Those are all things which should and could be addressed through quite simple means. And one of the things that I expect to be rolling out with the support of some of those friends over the course of the next quarter is actually not just a conversation starter for esports and safeguarding, but also hopefully some sharing of resource. Because one of the things that we recognize is when something is a thorny and tricky issue, sometimes it can be difficult for people to jump into it because it's just not a jumping off point. If we can say to people, start off with these 5 things, right? Start off with these 5 things, one of which is just to accept that you've got this obligation to make your environment safer for the children who are participating in it, right? And if you do that, then you're on the way. You've got something we can iterate and work with, and it's perhaps not as scary as you thought. And ultimately, if you do those things, maybe this really super scary end of safeguarding never actually manifests, because as an organization, you start to think about these things in advance. You start to look at it from a slightly different perspective. I bring all that into this maturity drive that needs to happen within esports. Like, valuations have always been bonkers in esports. Fnatic has never sought major valuations, but we also recognize that we recently raised at £100 million. That's a big, valuable organization. You have to do things in a way which protects that value in the long term. And for me, safeguarding is one of those things. Putting aside, again, the absolute priority here, which is look after children that are interacting with your business. Like, everyone should have that as just a core moral sort of obligation.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, particularly that, you know, the audiences of Fortnite and the people who are excelling at Fortnite are so young. A client of ours hosted a tournament and sort of did a tour across various stadiums in the UK, called eStars, featuring Fortnite. And I think the winner of the prize money was 12 or 13 or 14. But yeah, really crazy young. But great to see that there's a sort of manifesto for change and some buy-in from various members of the esports community. Andrew, I'm going to pass it over to Moritz now to present on some of the key issues that he can see from a German perspective. But we'll pull you back in at the end for the sort of general Q&A. So I'm going to turn off my video and pass over to Moritz. So Moritz, thanks very much for your time, and thank you, Andrew.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Andrew, for your insights. Hello, everyone. Maybe I can add a bit to the revenue discussion or insights we had from Andrew right now, and start off with my favorite topic coming from a digital background is the role of data or data licensing in esports. Some of you might have seen the movie Moneyball back in 2011, and all of you probably will know that data plays a big role revenue and value-wise in sports. Data can be used to in training purposes or analytic purposes. It is used to measure performances and therefore to actually measure the worth of player and teams in competition matches. Another way to use data in traditional sports already is for audience engagement, fan engagement. If you think of the TV of Dortmund has a digital TV with lots of analytics and short clips to engage their audiences. All the statistics you see in media coverages, the analytic desks, pre-match infos, it's all to engage the audience a bit more. And the third category would be digital products and such as gambling products. We can see in the newspaper, I think the lawsuits of Sportradar and Genius. I think there's two lawsuits right now. So data plays a significant role, has value, and can add to the revenue stream in my experience, not necessarily for the teams such as North, but definitely for tournament organizers and service providers. And in traditional sports, I think it only gets started. If one of the biggest projects last year was in Germany was a project for a data platform between Bundesliga and Amazon Web Services. I think they are building quite a big backbone for data analytics for all these 3 points of data use. Why am I talking about traditional sports? My point being is traditional sports is analog. So we need to build lots of devices and measurement tools to actually extract the data. And today when we talk about esports, it's a pure digital play. We already have the player already play in the digital stadiums, kind of on maps. All the raw data is there. So you could kind of say esports is a digital sandbox to try and see what we can do with the data, and maybe even be a role model for traditional sports. To come back why it's a legal academy, I try to present a bit the legal crux from data is, very simply put, there is no IP for data as per se. Data per definition, you would say, is any information in an electronic format. Can be anything. Can be a number or the latest manuscript to your new movie idea. And if it's a manuscript of your new movie idea, it certainly would fall under IP rights and it would be covered by copyrights most likely. But the data used in traditional sports and esports would be more like how many goals scored Cristiano Ronaldo, or what's the hit rate of Simple in CSGO. And this information in an electronic form is not covered by IP rights at all. So it's more open-wise. If we talk about data licensing in esport or in traditional sports, it's always more of a complex data governance structure than a simple IP or grant of rights from an IP perspective. And maybe to even add on that, for a bigger difference between esport and traditional sports when we talk about data is there's a very, how to put it, distinctive speciality for esports and data as how to put it. In sports, let's talk about football. All the assets and players are on the field. The strategies evolve in real time. They might change some players, but that's basically all there is for the competitiveness of a match. In esports, it's much different. If you talk about Counter-Strike as a shooter, the mechanics of the game are that 2 teams spawn on different sides of maps. We have kind of a fog of war, as you might call it, or the effect of the map will be you don't know what the other team will be and where it will be, where it will go, and most importantly, depending on what utility, that means what grenades or special tools the other team will buy, different strategies will be viable. And the information about that in esports it's crucial to the competitiveness. So we have a big integrity point when you talk about data licensing in esports that does not exist in the same way in sport. So if we talk about this data governance licensing tool, and we come back to Genius and Sports Radar, they will usually use the data best undelayed, that's the best quality kind of, to manage their risk and put on and create their odds, to create their betting products. And if it's undelayed data, it's very important that data licensing will be kept very, let's say, tight. And we have seen many instances in the last year, not always related to betting, but we had in the CSGO scene the spectator bug. It was basically a bug where if you used a certain mechanism, you could see what the other team were buying or doing, used to advantage. And that's something where the industry, in my experience, will need to grow or embrace more best practices, kind of. And hi Tom.
Moritz, just jumping in there. We've had a question about doping in esports, but I think we could potentially answer this by looking at integrity more generally. Do you think the use and exploitation of data poses a real integrity issue, and is this the biggest issue facing integrity within esports?
Yes, data use definitely poses a threat to the integrity in esports. Is it the biggest integrity issue? I'm torn. I would say, well, Andrew said the salaries of players have skyrocketed and are pretty high. They are still no match for the volume of money that's made by esport betting. So we have a big discrepancy between what's at stake when whales or lots of money betting on esport matches compared to the volume of money to the salaries of players. So I think there is also some work to be done integrity-wise to safeguard players from this big discrepancy and what might come of it. So it's not always data, but it is one big integrity issue as well. Yeah.
No, thanks very much. We often see that in sports such as tennis, where it's the players that are paid less who are much more open to accepting bribes, because a £5,000, £10,000 bribe to throw a game is significantly more valuable to them than perhaps it would be to a footballer. So I can completely see that, particularly in the lower leagues where people aren't getting paid as much. That could be a really serious issue.
Yeah, in esport, I think it especially increases this point when you have last year with COVID. I want to do the second topic would be gambling. So maybe that's a transition already. When the gambling industry was short on traditional sports content to actually do betting and gambling on, they would go, well, we have seen a huge increase last year in esport betting to fill the gap. And there also was not enough esport content to fill the gap in the beginning. So lots of small only online tournaments came up just to produce. It was kind of to increase the map count, to increase the esport content count, just to fill in for the betting. And these small online tournaments, these are, in my opinion, especially vulnerable for this discrepancy between the actually betting volume and their salaries or prizes that could be won by the tournaments. second topic from my perspective I picked for today is gambling. Gambling in Germany especially. In the last, I think, 8 years, Germany is supposed to have a very strict gambling regulation. I think until 2008, there was no gambling at all, it was just prohibited. And then we opened up and tried to at least allow some gambling, like lotteries and other stuff. You need to know Germany is a federal republic, so we have 16 states, and all 16 states always have to come together and conclude a state treaty, as it's a state matter and not a national matter. So it's hard enough to find a state treaty on gambling with the 16 states and all interests involved. But they managed at sometime, it wasn't long before the CGEU, the Court of Justice of the European Union, canceled this state treaty on gambling and took all measures of gambling authorities in Germany away to actually enforce the regulations. Meaning the result was any sports book or gambling product that had a license in Europe could basically offer their product in Germany, even if it would be illegal under the regulation. It went so far as that authorities went against payment provider as they couldn't reach the sport books. Some of you might have heard that big payment provider like PayPal completely stopped doing any payment business in gambling in Germany as a result of that. But back to esports, this big gray area and unenforceability of gambling regulation in Germany led to a lot of esports gambling products in the last, especially in the last year, but also before. This will probably change after many years and lots of gray gambling activities. All 16 states managed to get together and do a new state treaty, which will come into effect in, I think it's 21st of July this year. And while it's kind of a much broader regulation than the one before that was canceled, esport itself will not, it's not explicitly mentioned, but there will be a huge relatively liberal licensing scheme for sports betting, which is a huge change from before. Before we only had like 20 concessions, and I think only one of them was ever granted actually. So we will have a big influx in licenses for sport betting, whereas esport there, yeah. This will also be my last point. General esport regulation in Germany. There is no esport specific betting license. There will not be any. But the definition of sports betting under the new regulation would likely also, not all betting products, but esports betting, if it's within the definition. I think the definition is betting on competitive matches under fixed rules or something like this, very open. And the competent authorities will have to decide if some esport betting will fall under it or not. I'm not sure we will see a license for fantasy or similar products. You have a question, Tom?
No, sorry, Mats. I thought you were wrapping up. But if you've got another point, please go ahead.
No, I just wanted to, I wanted to do the overall esport regulation really short, maybe, to connect to the gambling regulation point. There is no esport regulation in a total in Germany. It's just a very different laws here and there. It's the same for sports actually. So the esport might fall under gambling regulation, but it would not be qualified as a sport under tax regulation. And I will only stick to the tax regulation, as I can see we are far ahead in time. The tax regulation is especially important for the ecosystem of esport, as it would allow sport clubs or association or the fundamental ecosystem, not the super professional teams, to actually be privileged under law. They don't fall under employment law. If they are an association, they get funding, they get tax cuts. And that would be a huge boost in the ecosystem for Germany. However, the sports lobby at the moment is so strong, they kind of deny esport the place under the tax law, and therefore the huge boost for the economy. In my opinion, due to the association and the fixed hierarchy, the associations play a huge role in the regulatory landscape. They don't want to, they want to retain their power, kind of. If they would allow esports under the sports regime and regulation, they would lose their say in everything, because esports, with esports, publishers as IP owner would enter, and they would be much more, from a legal perspective, much more powerful than the traditional sports associations. But yeah,
fantastic. Thanks very much, Moritz. So lots of potential changes from a regulatory perspective in Germany. And for those of you who don't know, there's obviously a number of leading esports teams that are based in Germany. And there's Big, there's Schalke, just to name two. We also have the LEC based out of Berlin as well. So it's really an area where just becoming sort of the European centre for esports, which I have to say is sad as a result of Brexit in the UK. I'm now going to pass over to a video that's been prepared by Stuart Lester, who is an associate in our brands group and our esports group. And Stuart's prepared this, and he's going to be talking about the use of third-party trademarks in video games. And after the video, we'll be joining back for a Q&A with the panelists. So Stuart, over to you. Thanks very much.
Hi everyone, my name is Stuart Lester. I'm an intellectual property lawyer at Mishkondareya. I specialise in all areas of intellectual property with a particular focus on brand protection and brand enforcement. I'm also part of the Mishkon Sport and Esports group. In this short talk, I'm going to be speaking to you about third-party trademarks in video games. I'm going to cover two recent cases which have brought this topic into focus. One of the emerging battlegrounds for brands owner is video games, and particularly with the growth of virtual reality applications in esports. But it also represents a massive opportunity for brands to license their IP and to make more money. For many game publishers, one of their main objectives is to make their game look as lifelike as possible. The reason gamers love to play the FIFA football game is because it offers the players a chance to come as close as possible to that feeling of what it's like to be a professional sports superstar. In order to do this, FIFA spends hundreds of millions of pounds to license intellectual property and many more millions to digitally recreate it. For example, FIFA licensed lots of IP owned by the Premier League, including even things like patches for referees and assistant referee uniforms and the Premier League logos. FIFA also licensed the IP to every Premier League club name, their kit, their crest, their stadium. And that's all in the latest FIFA series. All 20 Premier League stadiums appear in perfect detail, and each Premier League team has its own anthems and songs recorded. And that's all in the game. This is an example of where a games publisher and a brand owner can both benefit. The game gets to use the IP and so makes the game incredibly lifelike. And the brand owners get their name in front of the faces of millions of players, and they also get a big chunk of money. In fact, EA Sports' deal with the Premier League from last season until the season of 2024-25, it's understood to be worth well in excess of $30 million per year. But not all publishers, like FIFA, actively go out and make deals with the brand owners. Some games include third-party brands in their games without permission, and this is where disputes can arise. The question is, do they need to obtain permissions or not to use those marks in their games? Well, in a US case last year, vehicle manufacturers AM General made a claim against the creators of the Call of Duty game over the use of Humvees in their games. As I'm sure you're all aware, Call of Duty is a first-person shooter video game franchise that sold hundreds of millions worldwide. And Humvees are military vehicles used primarily by the US Army. So AM General claimed that by featuring the Humvee trade dress, which is another word for the visual appearance of the vehicles, and also for including the trademarks for Humvee within the Call of Duty game, the creators had deceived consumers into believing that AM General had approved or licensed or sponsored the game in some way. Now, this went to the US District Court for the Southern District of New York, and they held that the depiction of the Humvee vehicles within the Call of Duty games, including the reproduction of the trademarks, did not infringe those trademarks. In granting a judgment against the claim, they said that while it is metaphysically possible to have produced video games without the presence of the Humvees, they increased the game's realism. The game included the US military, and the Humvee vehicles are used by the US militaries and therefore fulfilled a genuine purpose within the game. Obviously, this is unique to US law, but it's possible that a UK court would have reached a similar outcome, though for probably different reasons. And to explain that, I want to talk about a final case in the UK that has some parallels with the Humvee case. And this relates to the popular video game Football Manager. So this is a case between Manchester United Football Club and the makers of the popular Football Manager game. Last year, Man United sued Football Manager, claiming that the inclusion of the Man United name, Manchester United name, within the game as one of the teams that players can manage, that infringed the EU trademark for Manchester United, because Football Manager had not asked for permission or paid a license to use the trademark. More unusually, there was also a second claim that the exclusion of the club crest within Football Manager amounted to an infringement of the EU trademark for the crest as well. Football Manager actually doesn't use Man United's logo. It's just a simple red and white striped logo. So this claim is based on a pretty novel argument that given the game uses the team name and all the real names of the players and staff, that users of the game would expect to also see the official club crest. And so by not using the club crest intentionally, because Football Manager, because there's copyright in the logo, and so Football Manager would have to pay for a license to use that. So they had intentionally not included it, and that deprived Man United of the right to make money from licensing opportunities. The case is a little bit difficult to comment on in too much detail because it's still ongoing, and it's still at an early stage, in fact. But it seems that for Man United to successfully argue that the use of their name infringes their trademark, we think they're going to have to convince the judge that the average consumer playing the game would think that Manchester United had licensed the use of its trademarks within the game. As we've seen in games like FIFA and PES, it has long been customary for makers of football simulation games to obtain licenses to feature football teams in the game under their real names. And we know that, and we know that gamers are probably aware of that, because over the years, there have been some team names or countries, players' names that have not been included in FIFA. For instance, in the current FIFA, Juventus, Italian giants Juventus, are called Piedmont Calcio. And that's because they didn't get the license from Juventus to include their name within the game. So gamers of FIFA probably realize that there is licensing going on. However, does the same apply for Football Manager? Football Manager is a game that's been in existence for a very long time, and it's got a very loyal fan base. And perhaps they've got a different expectation when it comes to licensing and the licensing and use of names compared to FIFA, for example. Perhaps that practice has not built up in the same way, and we have to draw a distinction between these types of games. Also, as the makers of Football Manager pointed out in their defense, their game has been using Manchester United's name in different versions since 1992. So this is the first time that they're complaining about it. It's going to be a really interesting case to hear the outcome certainly from a UK legal perspective, because if Man United succeeds in its claim over the use of the club name, then games like Football Manager and other video games will have to either buy a license to use the names of those real teams, or they'll have to adopt a different strategy, which is to use fake names completely. And that latter approach is probably not going to sit very well with the gamers of Football Manager, who would, it wouldn't be such a great experience if they were managing Man Red, for example. And if Man United also succeeds on its claim that not using the club crest infringes that trademark, which is a pretty novel argument, but that could force game publishers to pay for licenses for trademarks which, they're not really even using, or that they don't want to use. On the other hand, if Man United are not successful, then this lucrative industry that has been built up under which companies like FIFA and PES pay a lot of money to license IP could be dealt a bit of a blow. Certainly there'll be smaller gaming companies or other platforms like fantasy football games or betting operators that might seize upon that opportunity to use club names without permission and without a license. Of course, the eventual decision could also simply highlight that this is quite a unique case where Football Manager turns on its own facts. We've got a game that's been built up for 3 decades, where the practice of licensing has simply not evolved in the same way, and the gamers of Football Manager and those loyal gamers don't have the same expectations as other games. And that can't be applied to newer games where there's not such a history and fan base. So in closing, as we've discussed today, the use of IP in video games is incredibly valuable for the game publishers in order to make the game as realistic as possible. But there's also an opportunity for brand owners to get their products and brands out to a large audience. This is not something that's particularly new. For years, skateboarding brands appeared heavily in Tony Hawk's series, for example. But with the immense popularity of gaming and the increasing level of interaction with consumers, and their interaction with those video games, brand owners are becoming increasingly aware of the value and the opportunities that they've got to license their IP in all different kinds of ways. Therefore, for content creators, they should really be mindful of the potential need to obtain consent whenever they're using third-party IP, whether that's in their virtual world, in esports games or whatever. And that's particularly the case where the public might believe that those brand owners have given their consent or have some association with the game. And that brings to an end this talk on third-party trademarks in video games. If you have any queries, please do get in touch. Thanks for listening.
Stuart, thanks very much for that. I found that really interesting. I think as someone who sort of grew up playing FIFA and other football games, so Pro Evolution Soccer and This Is Football, I think we've all seen how for a game to feel lifelike and to feel valuable. I often would refuse to play Pro Evolution Soccer because they didn't have the real names of players or teams. And I know this issue sort of gone back a number of years. I think it's one of the original FIFAs from the late 90s that Ronaldo didn't feature, and he had a different name. This is not the Ronaldo everyone knows now, but Fat Ronaldo, as many people call him. So yeah, it's for a long time it's been an issue. Stuart, one thing I'd really sort of be keen to get your thoughts on is, and I know you work with a lot of fashion brands, is there collaboration between fashion brands and video games? So over the past few years, this has been going on for a number of years now. We've seen people like Louis Vuitton collaborate with League of Legends. We've seen Marc Jacobs and Valentino sort of produce collections for Animal Crossing with Nintendo. and I'm sure Andrew will be able to talk to this, but even Fnatic have collaborated with Gucci, and so members of the Fnatic team attended a Gucci show in Milan, and they've also released sort of a co-branded watch together. What do you think the sort of intellectual property issues are when fashion brands are looking to collaborate with video games to create both in-game items and also collections that are based on the video game out of sort of in real life?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Andrew will be able to speak about this because of his collaboration. But I mean, for a starter, these arrangements are much more complex than traditional sports industry. I suppose the main consideration really is looking at the ownership of that IP and the licensing of that IP and the items that are created for use in those games. So there's lots of IP rights to consider. And I guess when those fashion brands and the publishers are negotiating that collaboration agreement, they need to clearly set out and identify who owns what and who has got the ability to kind of enforce and license that IP going forward. So if we take the example of a fashion brand that's created like a designer jacket, for example, and that's going to be featured in a game, some of the considerations that they'll want to retain ownership of that IP for a start. Any design rights in that garment or any trademarks that are appearing, they'll want to make sure that they retain that IP. And they'll obviously then have to negotiate a license to the publisher for how they're able then to use that IP going forward, or even using it later on for merchandising purposes. And then, of course, there's going to be a lot of quality control. So, you know, as a fashion brand and as a high-end fashion brand, you're going to want to make sure that whatever's digitally created, that you're happy with, and that you're happy with that digital asset. So there'll be, when you're negotiating that agreement, there's just going to be a number of things that you're going to want to have to get right. And I guess so the takeaway is to make sure that your contractual position is clear.
Andrew, I'd love to bring you back in here to talk a bit about Fnatic's collaboration with Gucci, because I think Fnatic took a lot of people by surprise, actually, as one of the first esports organizations to sort of collaborate with a luxury fashion brand as opposed to someone like Nike or Adidas, but to really go high end. So could you tell us a little bit about the collaboration, and also why you think that luxury fashion brands are looking to esports and video games more generally?
Yeah, well, I think it's a really interesting how it kind of came about, and I think what it tells us about almost the future of high-end brands in terms of digital inventory in particular, right? So I think Gucci was interested to get into the esports space. Obviously, Louis Vuitton had made its move in the sort of prior League of Legends World Championships, building the case for the trophy, and also introducing some sort of like specific artworks around that event that built on something they'd already done for the World Cup, right? So when the World Cup was in Brazil, I think Louis Vuitton also built the case for that. Yeah. Gucci wanted to approach the space authentically through teams and use teams to activate particular sort of personalities within the space. And therefore you had the slightly odd picture of our League of Legends front five, who are not necessarily famed for their fashion sense, and sitting with Mark Ronson on the front row of a Gucci runway show in the wonderful pre-COVID days. But yes, but fun, and still now seeing players like Hylissang sort of lounging around our Berlin gaming house in extremely hard to find North Face times Gucci t-shirts, without perhaps necessarily understanding that you could, pop that on Depop and probably, buy a car. But anyway, the Gucci piece isn't just about the watch. So as Stuart mentioned, Gucci's business is manufacturing those kind of things. We can obviously put our own stamp on it. And several members of our team, our head of product and our CEO, went over to Gucci's facilities and got lots of lol-worthy pictures of them in kind of Gucci white coats inputting into the piece, and it's fun. Like that's the kind of the front end of the collaboration. But actually, the Gucci Dive game that was attached to it, and particularly the appearance of a Fnatic submarine in that playable game, which then rolls out across iOS and drives this kind of commonality and brand value, is really where the action lies, which sounds crazy because it's a mobile game, which isn't necessarily esports or let's say most people's perception of esports, putting aside PUBG and those kind of things, the bulk of the mobile games that are played are more at the Candy Crush end than they are at the PUBG mobile end. But ultimately, that's what it's about. This is about extremely high-end brands starting to understand the places in which their consumers operate, right? The channels through which they activate those consumers, and how authentic participants in those channels can help bridge them into it, right? So very broadly speaking, and again, I'm sorry to paint a very broad brush. If you're in the fashion space, apologies for butchering this, but ultimately there are markets that are extremely attractive, most obviously China, for luxury brands. We've seen that with the Year of the Ox stuff that's all sort of popped off recently, Burberry, Gucci, all these kind of offerings that are specifically targeted to the Chinese consumer. And China is the world capital of esports, which is why the League of Legends World Championships is there for multiple years. I mean, Chinese fan interest in esports is very high. Chinese fan future expectation of spending in China is very high. It's not as mature an esports market as the US, but multiple teams consider it offers quite a considerable opportunity. And Gucci, obviously, being at the absolute bleeding end of fashion, of brand leverage in that space, is interested to link those kind of things together. It's noticing these trends, and that offers an opportunity for us. And for Gucci. I don't think Fnatic will be the last team org that Gucci collaborates with, but we were very proud to sort of lead in that space. And I think there's more fun stuff will happen with those kind of brands. You know, I described it as esports 1.0, where you sit between the brand and the fans. But actually, that evolution of how we use digital inventory and sponsors and brands becoming more sophisticated about how they approach that issue, I think offers a slightly different spin on that kind of guidance. It's not just about connected to the audience. It's also about, we talked about this with football teams, and I touched on it earlier on, right? Big football teams wanting to get into esports, right? Because they want to activate digital inventory, they see it as something that delivers ROI, and they're looking for esports as a platform to do that. We're happy to work with brands to help them activate that space.
That's really interesting, Andrew. And I think you guys have been sort of really flying the flag there, and particularly with the collaboration with Nike as well. Moritz, I'd be keen to bring you in here and to see what your views are on the creation of digital assets. And do you think that the esports and video games gives people a license to be sort of more experimental in their collaborations and to sort of have a bit more fun than they ordinarily would in perhaps a traditional sports sponsorship or collaboration?
I think from your question point of view, it could be, but I think they don't do it yet, or at least what I have experienced here in Germany. If we, example, take the Mercedes sponsorship of the ESL, from what they told publicly and what you can hear from the scene, it was kind of a bumpy road. It started off with you would say a storm kind of wrong message. What would be the community's labeling would edgy, probably. It would be too edgy, kind of. But they, with ESL's help and the knowledge of the space and the ecosystem, they managed to turn it around beautifully. And I think that highlights Andrew's point that it is an exciting space with lots of opportunities, but it always helps if you have someone to guide you through the beginning who's already experienced.
Yeah.
So back to your question, I don't think big brands will jump in and just try something super new right from the bat. But once they've become comfortable, they might.
I think that's true. I think and Stuart, it'd be interested to get your views on this, but I think there's been some interesting examples of how brands have collaborated in the virtual world through sponsorships in a way that they never would perhaps in the traditional world. So Stuart, I know we were discussing this a couple of days ago about the collaboration between Burger King and Stevenage Town, which is a football club, for those who aren't aware, in between sort of London and Cambridgeshire. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that and how effective that was as a collaboration.
Sure. I mean, for anybody that's not seen that collaboration, that promo video by Burger King, I really encourage you to watch it because it's really cool. But I mean, yeah, I mean, it's an example where Burger King identified Stevenage as a team to sponsor, not because of their skills in the real world. In fact, they chose them because they were so bad, but because they saw marketing opportunity and because they knew that that team would appear in FIFA. So that's really interesting. And then because that team appeared in FIFA and obviously their kit shows this big Burger King logo, their logo is getting in front of the audience, in front of a huge audience, and they're able to create a marketing campaign where people are trying to get Stevenage to the top of the pyramid. So, I mean, it's really interesting that they chose that team, not because of how good they are, but because they're in a virtual world.
No, definitely. I think there's a number of different people are sort of looking at doing digital activation. So I support a charity called Alive and Kicking, who essentially employ people to create. It's the world's first non-for-profit ball manufacturer, and they release a kit each year, and it's been going quite well. But this year they decided to release it to make it available for the Ultimate Team, and it's a really wavy kit, and the number of downloads and the number of people they've had playing in it is just completely skyrocketing. And it's really sort of brought some attention to the brand. Stuart, whilst I've got you, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. We touched on the sort of collapse of North earlier, and for those who have seen North's logo, that it's a spin on the FC Copenhagen logo that also features a lion. I wondered what sort of challenges you think that esports teams might face when they co-create a logo that's based on an existing mark.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest challenge is what happens when things go wrong and that collaboration ends, because obviously it seems quite clever to adopt a brand for your esports team that is similar to an existing sports team, because you already get a head start. People already recognize it. There's already some goodwill and reputation associated with that brand. But then what happens when that collaboration comes to an end? I mean, in the worst case scenario, you'd have to rebrand completely because, say, FC Copenhagen don't want anything to do with North anymore, but continuing to use that logo will risk consumers thinking that there's still a link between them. And if there's no contractual terms about what happens after that, if that agreement's terminated, then yeah, that's a huge risk to have to rebrand and start from scratch, essentially. So, I mean, that's the risk with adopting a brand like that. I'm not saying don't do it, because I think it's incredibly valuable to get that head start. But if you are going to adopt a brand like that, make sure that your contractual terms clearly state what's going to happen, who retains the rights in that logo, that they can continue to operate using that brand.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I think another real example of someone not only basing their logo on an existing brand, but completely adopting the brand for their esports business is Schalke. And Moritz, it'd be good to get your views on this as a German. What have you made of the Schalke situation, and what sort of challenges do you think they'll face in the LEC and perhaps trying to sell their place in the franchise?
Yeah, that's a difficult point, actually. I think Schalke's position is a really difficult one. If you have followed the club the last years, it's said, at least about them, that they are big times in debt. I think about 200 mil or above. And if you think about the fact that they even consider selling this huge investment they did a few years ago, supposedly cost them 8 million euros. And now it's available. Well, the estimates go about maybe 20. Maybe Andrew has a better estimate, but it clearly tells about their position to give up this big future investment that kind of was also supposed to maybe get them out of their big debt at some point in the future. So that's my take on the situation. And with their legal challenges, we'll probably need to find the right buyer and actually write a proof of this buyer and the overall strategy, as publishers are full control of their franchises, and by the rule book, I think they have the last say.
And Andrew, I'm going to bring you in for the last comment here. But how do you think the sort of the collapse of Schalke is going to affect the competitive balance in the LEC and also the sustainability of the franchise league more generally?
Big question. On Moritz's point about valuation, I hope it goes for about 300 million, that franchise, because then that will that slightly improves Fnatic's balance sheet. But I think I think it's really interesting point about the maturity of esports. The Bundesliga team is looking to its esports franchise to bail it out. Like the idea, I think if you said even 5 years ago, okay, a team in a major sports league in Europe is going to look to it's going to pull a lever marked esports asset when it's in distress, and actually for that to be adequate compensation to get it back in a position of kind of solvency potentially is pretty interesting. It says a lot about the driving of franchise values. I think LEC as a opportunity is obviously super interesting. I think, as Tom has indicated, and you mentioned as well, Moritz, Riot is not going to allow that slot just to go to anybody, right? Because ultimately Riot is interested in making sure that the LEC remains the hottest entertainment property and the sort of the best expression of the top tier of League of Legends in the world. That's what we want, that's what the teams want, and ultimately that drives the league revenue pool that we all participate in. So I don't think there's going to be and also, as you mentioned, Riot has total veto power effectively, because it says, and again, we've made a lot of assumptions about the level of understanding of the audience around the esports ecosystem, but very broadly speaking, Riot has total control over what happens in League of Legends. This is not like football where you have some external body that owns the game. Riot owns the game, owns the league. It determines how the players are transferred. So that was a question in the chat. Someone asked me about player transfer structuring. There are transfer windows in League of Legends. There are common filings in League of Legends. We have to all put in the same paperwork. Riot determines how much players get paid from a minimum salary standpoint and so on, right? It's a very heavily structured thing. And Riot is not going to give access to that ecosystem to just anybody. Talking about sustainability in LEC more generally, or let's say in esports more generally, because of that COVID effect that we talked about, that's undoubtedly driven a conversation. And again, we come up to a lot of the same themes during the course of this, which is about maturity, right? Which is about developing understanding of the space, all those kind of things that have been driven by COVID. I think sustainability is a maturity conversation, right? Because you have to get to a level of sort of like relatively stable operations to be able to have that discussion. So that's good. We should be having that conversation. I think that's the right step. I think the challenges that some organizations are facing, which is insanely high player salaries and just nothing on the other side of the ledger, or let's say limited growth on the other side of the ledger, has also driven that conversation. So if we want the LEC and other leagues, LCS has the same issue in the US, to remain competitive and for people to keep watching, right? And for people to continue to invest in the LEC, which again, as Moritz has mentioned, does involve quite a significant buy-in. And the same is true of Overwatch and any other league which is franchising. You have to continue to look at these issues, and everything is on the table there. So, there are discussions ongoing. They're literally live right now, but fans can expect to see some developments in that area, certainly before the end of the year. And I would say probably more before the transfer window, because ultimately, if there are going to be sort of structural changes grandfathered in, that will need to start sooner rather than later. So I think that's a dynamic space, and it's something that I'll be looking forward to talking with you guys about later on in the year, a future module, or maybe when we deal this all again in 12 months' time.
Fantastic. Well, so yeah, certainly one to watch, guys. But unfortunately, we've gone just over time, so we're going to have to draw today's session to a close. But I just want to say a massive thank you to all of you for taking part. I didn't think we were going to be able to cover so many diverse topics. So we promised at the start it was going to be just as provocative as the Harry and Meghan interview. I don't think it was quite as provocative, and I don't think the royal household will be putting out any statements about this session. But thanks to many of you who have attended today. We'll be releasing a recording of this session in the coming days. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can. I think we've got through 18 of them, but we will, for the ones that we have left, we'll try and reach out afterwards. Many thanks to Andrew, who's been a bit of a keyboard warrior for us on the Fnatic side in answering the various questions. Our next session will focus on immigration and sport, and also the challenges that have been brought about as a result of Brexit, what this means to changes in the immigration rules, and whether this makes it easier for bringing over talent from various countries, and sort of what the challenges this brings. If you do have any questions or feedback, please do send these through. And until next time, we'll see you in the next session. So thanks very much. Goodbye.